professor of education at the University of Pennsylvania and also director of the International Literacy Institute. The institute itself was set up by Penn and by UNESCO about 15 years ago in order to focus on education and literacy issues, mainly in developing countries. So our institute has had a training program where we've brought specialists in education and literacy here to Philadelphia from about 75 different countries over the last 10-15 years. We've organized conferences here in Philadelphia, but also in Beijing, in Delhi, India, Dakar, Senegal, other parts of the world as well. Our goal has been, and my goal has been, to try to apply the best knowledge that we have, not just academic knowledge, but applied knowledge as well, to solving some of the world's most difficult issues in the area of basic education and literacy. Maybe to say a little bit about the definition of basic education and literacy. Basic education refers largely to primary schooling. And primary schooling, usually as we know it in the United States, runs from, let's say, kindergarten or first grade up through 5th or 6th grade. And that's largely the same around the world. There is some variation around the world, but that's pretty much it for kids who, from their beginning of school age up through early adolescence. In terms of literacy, literacy is defined somewhat differently. It refers to the basic skills of reading and writing and math that adults have from the age of about 15 to about 50 around the world. And most people think of the United States as a country that has a very high literacy rate. By UN standards, we do have a high literacy rate, somewhere over 95%. And that would be true in the United States and in Japan and in most of the European countries and so on. Though, in recent years, using a different measurement system, we actually know that in the United States we have lots of problems with literacy in our population, so that by some other definitions we have literacy problems among nearly 25% of the population. But if you look in the developing world, which is the focus of the United Nations and the UN Millennium Development Goals that you're familiar with, if you look around the world, the rates of literacy drop from, let's say, 95%, which is true in the European and wealthier countries of the world, to somewhere around 75%, sometimes 60%, sometimes lower than 60% in, say, sub-Saharan Africa and some of the poorer countries in South Asia, and in parts of countries as well. I suppose most of you are familiar with, there are a set of 8 Millennium Development Goals of the United Nations. And one of those goals is the right to access to universal basic education. And as we've seen, basic education usually is 5 or 6 years, where you are supposed to learn to read and write and know the basics of arithmetic and elementary mathematics. So this right is a focus of countries all over the world, and in some countries, as we said, in some of the wealthier countries, we make this assumption that all kids have this access, and it's largely true. But if you go to other parts of the world, we find that in sub-Saharan Africa is probably the most dramatic in this area, that somewhere around 30% of kids do not get 5 years of primary schooling in most of sub-Saharan Africa. That isn't to say that in the capital cities there aren't wealthy people whose children do quite well, but on average there are many kids who never get to school in the beginning, or who never complete basic education, that is, get to 5th grade. Now, for example, I just pulled up some statistics from UNESCO, which is the specialized agency of the United Nations that deals with education. And if you look at their rates of enrollment in sub-Saharan Africa, that's the African countries below the Sahara, the average completion rate, average for all children of school age, is only 57%, which means that nearly half the kids don't get through primary school. From a literacy perspective, that tends to mean that those kids do not have literacy in the way that can be maintained for the rest of their lives. So that's a huge issue. That means that about half the population will become adult illiterates after they drop out of school. And that is one reason why, and some people ask, why isn't the world more literate after all these years and decades of programs to deal with literacy? Well, if you can imagine that half the population is leaving, even if they've been to school, they're leaving without completing that basic skill. If you look at it over time, I brought some statistics here that show that progress has been made in terms of enrollment ratios. But in fact, these are in relatively small percentages. Sub-Saharan Africa has seen growth. And of course, some countries in Asia, countries like Indonesia and India, of course China, have shown dramatic increases over the last 10 or 20 years. But it must be understood also that even countries like Indonesia, China, India, have many minority populations where children do not achieve at nearly the rate of the kids who are in more mainstream ethnic groups. So one of the things to pay attention to when you're looking at national statistics, and I know that in the UN you're looking at generally national statistics, but national statistics from an individual perspective can be very misleading because many countries are multi-ethnic, and in those countries it can be that one ethnic group does extremely well or much better than the other groups. South Africa is a very good example, where about 20% of the population performs at the level of many industrialized wealthy countries, but 80% of the country performs at roughly the level of all the other surrounding countries that we were just talking about a moment ago. And South Africa, of course, has a unique political history. But if you look in many other countries in the world, you'll also find China is a good example, where we regularly hear very positive reports on the growth of the domestic national product, of education, and so on, but where if you go and you look at the important ethnic groups in China, you'll find that those growth rates are dramatically different across the country. And that's also true, of course, in the United States and in most other countries where there are multi-ethnic groups. I'll take a break there, too. A very important point besides the issue of multiple ethnic groups is the issue of the quality of education itself. So that when I stated a moment ago that 57% of kids complete, or only 57% of kids in Sub-Saharan Africa complete primary school, I have not said yet what they learn. Our assumption is that they're learning to read, write, and do math. But in fact, we have found that kids who actually complete primary school sometimes barely know the alphabet in the language that they're being taught. Now that brings up an issue. What is the language that they're being taught? If Africa is still our example, relatively few kids are being taught in their home language, in what we call their mother tongue, their first language, when they go to school. Why? Well, as most of you will know, almost all of Africa was colonized, and usually the colonial country imposed a national language on what was previously a set of tribal languages, often called tribal languages, really local or indigenous languages that have been used forever in the parts of Africa where the people live. When languages like English or French or Portuguese came into Africa and became the dominant language, the dominant official language, it was thought that everybody could learn a second language and life would be good. But it turns out that, for a variety of reasons, access to those languages has been very problematic, very difficult for the groups that didn't have very close contact with people who spoke those international languages like English, French, and Portuguese. Such that even today, in countries which we think of as being reasonably among the top performing groups in Africa, such as Senegal or Ghana or Kenya or South Africa, you find that one of the reasons why kids drop out of school is that they can't master or are unable to master English or French. Some kids do, some kids don't. So the quality of education turns out to be a very crucial aspect of success. This has been a problem, actually a problem for the United Nations, because national governments prefer to and find it much easier to look at access to education. If access to education is the human right, what's the right for the quality of education? If you go to a school and you're from, you speak Twi in Ghana, you may be living in the capital, Accra. You may have parents who speak English in your home, who have gone to the university in London or the United States or wherever. You might be an absolutely fluent English speaker, and some Ghanaians are among the highest performers in English, much like the Indian example I mentioned a moment ago. But there are many people who live in rural areas whose parents have never studied English at all, and for whom their teachers may not know English very well. Therefore, their access to English, their quality of education, is going to be far lower than that child in the urban area that has English-speaking parents. Now, the reality is that for the majority of kids in poor areas of sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of the world, their situations are really dramatically different in terms of quality of education than those who are more favored. Now, you might say, accurately, that this mirrors, or the United States is a similar country to, let's say, the case of Ghana or South Africa. And you would be right. It's just that the level of access to education is going to be lower in those other parts of the world, because here in the United States, most teachers do have some form of college diploma. Many of them have a master's degree. They have years of schooling. We have, in many ways, excellent textbooks. We have multimedia. People have laptops, so on and so forth. If you subtract all of the above from the Africa context, then you know why children are going to have a problem in school. They don't have teachers who have master's degrees. Many of them don't have teachers who even have a college degree itself, or even sometimes a secondary school diploma. Many of them have teachers who only have a primary school diploma. Many of these teachers don't speak the language they're supposed to be teaching in. So there are many problems, and access to textbooks and access to computers. Well, in many of these poor areas of Africa and in South Asia, you can forget it. Or I don't mean to not mention Latin America also. There are parts of Latin America, especially in the Andes, in rural parts of Latin America, especially among also in peoples who don't speak Spanish as their first language, where the same situation pertains. So that when we talk about education as a human right, we also have to talk about the issue of language. And when we talk about quality, we can't forget about gender issues. Because over many decades, issues of gender or the fault line of gender has usually been made a distinction between who gets into school and how much school you get if you're a boy or a girl. And that's been true for centuries in Europe and America, and it is still true today in many developing countries. There's no question that on average boys get better treatment by their families. They are pushed more to succeed in school, and in the opposite way, girls are often asked to do domestic chores, and therefore at one point or another are drawn out of the school system, and therefore the dropout rates of girls, even who enter at roughly the same levels when they go into school, often do not continue on into post-primary schooling and on into high school and university. However, interestingly enough, even though gender parity is, in the same way as primary schooling, one of the UN Millennium Development Goals, MDGs, it's actually in gender that we've made most gains. Gender parity is probably one of the success stories of the Millennium Development Goals. It won't be perfectly achieved around the world, but probably there's been greater success in getting girls into school than people thought possible in countries where 50% of the girls went to school 10 years ago. Now we're finding 75 to 80% of the girls going to school today. But again, that we can say, and you should say to yourselves, what does that mean in terms of how well girls do in school? Well, interestingly enough, in some countries, including in the United States, girls do better than boys, almost across the board. There are a few subject areas, physics and math, where boys are still managing to do better than girls in countries like the United States and in Europe and so on. But girls are now doing quite well. And in some poor countries, Morocco being one example, where there are more university students who are girls than there are boys, which is shocking given that 20 years ago there were 4 or 5 times as many boys as girls who were in universities. So what happened? Well, a lot of different things happen, and different countries have different kinds of explanations. But it's clear that parents have gotten the idea, and countries as well, that to have an educated workforce of professionals and well-trained people is something that's in everybody's best interest. So great efforts have been made at all levels to improve the education of girls. However, there is one key caveat to this matter, and that is in the poorest parts of the world, girls are not gaining the same access. That is, in the poor middle countries, not so poor countries, the girls are doing fine. In the wealthy countries, girls are doing great. Here in the United States, girls are, as I said, almost in all areas, exceeding the performance of boys across the board, in almost all areas. However, in the poorest countries, that's not true. And one of the reasons why there is a lag is not that there are not more girls getting into school. There are, and so people believe, some officials believe, national officials or international officials think that things are going well. But in fact, they're going less well than may be perceived by some statistics. And the reason is that in the poorest countries, 2 things are going on. One is domestic chores still are of tremendous importance. They are what allow parents to go and work. If both parents need to work, then somebody needs to take care of the kids. The girls are thought to be those who can best take care of siblings, younger kids or cousins or so on. Secondly, as related to the earlier issue we mentioned, which is language, girls, much more than boys, tend to be monolingual in the poorest countries of the world. So if you look at the Quechua in Peru, you look at Sepedi speakers in northern South Africa, you look at people who speak local languages, ethnic languages in China, you'll find that most of the boys are at least partially bilingual. They'll speak the national language or a regional language, but the girls tend to speak only one language. And that, of course, puts them at a key disadvantage when they get to school. So that after 2, 3, 4 years of schooling, they often find that learning that curriculum is a huge challenge, and that the teachers often don't respect them, the other children, their classmates don't respect them, so they feel very burdened, and they end up dropping out of school or not doing well in school. So that particular group, which is monolingual girls in poor countries, tend to have the roughest time. Therefore, when we talk about the human right of basic education or the human right of primary education, we have to be very careful. It's a right, but it doesn't mean that you can achieve that kind of equity for all in a straight line. You can't just declare it to happen. What you need to do, and this is what people like me, academics and researchers and people looking at innovation, are trying to do, is find ways of bridging the gap for those people who start at an important disadvantage. Now, in this country, in the United States, we think about that in terms of, say, Head Start or bilingual education programs. Those are good, important programs. Those kinds of programs are fairly rare in the developing countries. Preschool is still a pretty rare phenomenon in developing countries, and bilingual education programs often are there but don't work very well, because there's a tremendous emphasis that's put on the national language rather than on the local language. Thus, there's a kind of discrimination that takes place, and many children who come from these poor, monolingual, and in fact often gendered, that is to say girl-child environments, find their situation to be dramatically inferior to that of the other children who get to school. So remember, on this particular aspect of things, the right to education is not a right to the first day in class. The right to education is the right to learn in school, the right to have learned in school, the right to know how to read and write and do math and have access to the other goods that are available based on the education that you have around the world. I'll take a little break there.
Okay.
We could end there.
We could, that's actually a great closing statement, and we've got plenty of material. If you wanted to add anything, you're
Only
certainly
if
welcome
you think
to.
I missed anything. Your gender comment was very good.
No, in terms of, I loved what you said about it not being linear. So I guess for students and thinking about, because they think of linear relationships and time frames, and we have this Millennium Development Goal of education and equity and for all. So in terms of, I guess, where's the starting point in your opinion? It sounds like you have to go to the most rural areas so do you focus the resource on continuing to work to achieve in middle income countries as well, or do you shift the focus to the poorest of the poor?
Well, last week UNESCO released, you could take a look at this or make it a resource for students. If you go on the UNESCO website, you may know there's an annual report the UNESCO releases called the GMR.
Mm-hmm.
That ring a bell?
Mm-hmm.
Yes?
Yes.
The Global Monitoring Report.
Mm-hmm.
The most recent one, which is the 2010 GMR, is on marginalization.
Okay.
I consulted on that. I didn't run the program. That report is extremely important because that is essentially saying the same thing that I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
And it will make a big splash because it will say that, well, it'll take the same basic line, which is that it's not enough simply to pour more money in. You have to pour money in selectively if you're going to try to reach those goals, because 25% of the population, and in some countries up to 50% of the population, won't make it because of these problems of marginalization, what they call marginalization. I've just actually spent a sabbatical year plus, working on what I think is the way to go, but I think it's too technical for this particular piece, but just in case you're interested. And it fits well. It just so happens that the monitoring, I spent my year at UNESCO.
Okay.
So I was in Paris at their Planning Institute, which is in Paris. The IIEP is their Planning Institute. And my paper is on how do you know when kids are learning in school. So it's a more technical paper that looks at why it is that governments have not, I don't actually say this quite this in the paper, I probably should do more of it, is why isn't it governments know how to know whether people are failing in school in developing countries. Most of the governments are simply collecting data on who has attended school, but not what they've learned in school. So my paper, which is a fairly massive piece, is all the different kinds of assessments that have been used on learning mainly to read in school in developing countries in these L1 and L2 situations, learning in first language, second language, and so on. So my paper will be released fairly soon. It was commissioned by the World Bank and UNESCO. So that's the area that I'm working in, which is trying to add some teeth to, this is why, for me, a human rights perspective is just sort of the top of the iceberg. It's, you can proclaim, it's like South Africa, you can proclaim democracy. And trying to have democracy is another story. You could proclaim, like Mandela did, we're a rainbow nation. But getting there is another story.
Mm-hmm.
And so, to me, of course, I have the luxury, really, of being an academic, where then I can drill down, so to speak, and say, well, what do we really mean by these things? How do we define them? What are we going to do about them? And so that's the angle that I take. I don't think you can use any of
No, for my own interest, and I am going to go ahead and shut this off. I think.